Ladies and gentlemen, Fran Lebowitz.
The old one, not the young one.
I wonder if first we could just talk about something that Colin mentioned, which is your meeting first with Peter Hujar, how that first happened.
I was in a screening room at a screening. I had never met Peter. I'd heard of him. He was legendary, to the 27 of us who thought we thought we were the whole world. So, and we were right. It turns out. But I knew Vince Aletti, and I saw Vince. He was like sitting a little bit in front of me on the side, and I recognized Peter. I said, "Oh, that's Peter Hujar." And we watched the movie, whatever it was, I don't remember that. And when we got up, Peter was wearing, from what I could see, like a tweed jacket and a crew neck sweater, and then when he stood up, he was wearing a skirt. And first of all, for those of you who are younger than me, which is almost everyone, it was against the law. I mean, people got arrested, men got arrested for wearing a skirt in the street. This, however, was such a dowdy skirt, like a librarian might have worn. Some sort of like plaid pleated skirt that came to the ankles. And that's how I met Peter. He was wearing that. And I asked him, maybe not that minute, but I did ask him why he did that. Because it was not a real attempt to drag. He looked like a man wearing a skirt. And he said that he thought that it was unfair that women could wear pants, but men couldn't wear skirts. And so it was a kind of, it was an attempt at justice. Peter, actually considering that he really knew what unfair was, that's not an example of it.
The way that he would explain something like that, it's very hard to capture at second hand. We don't associate humor with Peter Hujar. The photographs, I think, are seen as still and perhaps on the border of somber. Is that incorrect?
No. I mean, if Peter told the story, it wouldn't have been funny.
It's very important.
It's not Peter that was so funny. But Peter, he could be funny. I mean, he could be witty, Peter, I'm not certain that this is, what I would have thought before I saw the movie, but there certainly was an aspect to Peter that I always found heartbreaking. Even when I first met him, which maybe you know what year this was, I don't, but I might have been like 21 or 22 or something like that, and Peter was 37 when I met him. I remember thinking, God, this guy is so old. So he was always much older than me, but I always found him heartbreaking because there was always in Peter, no matter what, even when he was in a rage, which was frequent, if not hourly, he was a motherless child. He was like an abandoned child, and that was in every single second of him. When his face is at rest, you see that. Peter, even when he took his own photograph, is not really posing, in the way that most people do, and the way, in fact, that everyone now does. And so, yeah, I think that is true, that Peter was, I wouldn't say grim. I would not say that Peter was grim. And Peter certainly had a sense of humor. Soon after I met him, I started calling him Pete, and apparently no one had ever done this. And he loved this. So he would always say to me when he called, "Hi, it's Pete." I think that, that's like a kid name, and maybe he didn't have that kind of childhood, where someone called him Pete. And so he loved that I called him Pete.
Pizzo is the way that he signed his letters to friends from Italy in about 12
I did not
years
know
ago.
him then.
So, yes, right. And so what were you doing at that time? To push it back just a little, you had come to New York. You and Peter are both from New Jersey.
Right, I'm more from New Jersey than Peter was.
Right. And it seems like a crazy question to ask you, but what did you come to New York for, and were you doing it?
I came for this.
Well done.
And girls. Those two things I came for. And they were both here.
That was fortunate.
Asked and answered.
Yes. Of that moment in New York, we were talking a little beforehand about nostalgia and about certain periods of history that seem to be prone to nostalgia. And as we've discovered, the 1970s seem to have whatever it takes. But leaving nostalgia aside, is it true, not just in a back in my day sort of way, that there's something distinct, in New York specifically, that is a before and after, something that is lost in the period that we're looking at in
Well, yeah, for
these
sure. I mean,
photographs?
of course, not when you're living in it, I mean, Paris in the 20s was always the thing, the glamorous, bohemian life, Paris in the 20s. And New York in the 70s has come to be some sort of equivalent of that, by which I mean people still, think of Paris in the 20s in that way. And it seems to me that, should the, world last beyond Donald Trump, that people will think of New York in the 70s that way. The reason I know that is because kids are constantly asking me about New York in the 70s. This is not a natural thing, I think, for young people. In other words, when I was 20, I wasn't constantly asking people about like New York in the 30s, and they always say, I wish I, lived in New York in the 70s. So that it's one thing for people who were there. It's one thing to be nostalgic for your own youth, which everyone is. When you see the pictures of Peter's or any pictures taken in that era, I was thinking when I was watching this movie that to people who are young, they might think that Peter sought out, extremely destroyed areas of the city. But that was it, except for the Upper East Side. That was pretty much it. Even one of those pictures in the hallway of the building was someone's, that was Peter's hallway. Now, I don't remember thinking, my God, someone's, dead or sleeping or passed out or, in the hallway. Just, you routinely stepped over people in people's hallways. They might have been dead. They might not have been dead. This really wasn't that much a concern to me if I didn't know them. Sometimes I did, in which case I stopped to check. There was one picture, I think, more than one, you had inside what we used to call the piers, when the piers
Yes.
were burned down.
Mm-hmm.
Peter took me there.
Okay.
Now, with that place, once it burned down, or maybe it was set on fire, or it probably wasn't one fire because they were massive, they went for blocks. Mm-hmm. And men used to go there for sex. And so Peter would talk about it to me, and I said, well, I want to see it. I want to go. So he took me. Now, I don't know what I imagined it would be. It was in the daytime, and even though parts of it were missing, so there was some light coming in, it was really dark, much darker than for some reason I had imagined it would be. And Peter took me as a way as here it is, and then he disappeared. And I walked in, and within 9 seconds, some guy grabbed my crotch, and because he didn't expect me to be there, and I left. And I was frightened in a way by it. And I stood outside for a while thinking, well, Peter's going to realize I'm not there and come out, but of course he didn't.
One way that I think you contributed to Peter's life was as a driver.
That is true. Well, because I at certain times, maybe at certain point, I had a car. At first, I had my still high school car. Then I inherited my grandmother's car briefly. But what I had was a driver's license, which no one at interview had a driver's license. No one at interview, as you can imagine, had any competency in anything at all. So I was perhaps the most skillful person there with being in possession of an actual driver's license. And the interview had to be printed in Vineland, New Jersey, which, since it's in New Jersey, makes it seem close, but it's 3 million miles away. And the paper had to be actually taken there. I forget what they were called, these, to be on these metal sheets that's transferred. They don't obviously do this anymore. And it had to get there at 7 o'clock in the morning. And they had to stay through the whole print run and then bring back the first copies. And so I used to do this because, I got $50 for this, which was much more than I got for writing. And Peter always wanted to come with me because he wanted to go anywhere. Because, it cost money to go anywhere. So Peter would often come with me. It would be pitch black, it's very dark in the morning. And it would get light as we get out there. And Vineland was kind of rural then. I think that might be the first time I realized how much Peter loved animals, something that I did not share with Peter. And Peter would make me stop. And I would always, because you want to take a picture of a cow or like a rabbit or, something like that, which I would, of course, not even notice. And I would always say, we'll do this on the way back because we have to get to the paper, we have to get there in time. And frequently we did, which means he was going into the woods off the highway, in the pitch dark. I don't know anything about photography from the technical point of view, so, I can't tell if a photograph was taken with a bright light, in the dark, but some of them were.
Mm-hmm. There was a group of pictures there. It's a single contact sheet in the whole collection that's flash pictures made in the woods in New Jersey. And I think they must
That's where they're made, because he would make me pull over, and then and I would say, Peter, it's so dangerous to go into the woods. To me, like, going to the piers didn't seem that dangerous, but, going to the woods where, there are wolves and,
Jersey. And where else would you go? And with a group, or did you?
No, well, we used to go very often to Coney Island, which was, someone said, my father's parents lived in Brighton Beach before it was Russian, so I knew Coney Island from my childhood, and you could just go there. We could go on the subway, or if I had a car, we could go in the car. And people say, why did you go all the time? I said, well, that's what we did instead of go to the south of France. We went to Coney Island. And Peter, I'm telling you, he would go anywhere. He wanted to go somewhere, and he would go anywhere. And he was always fun to go with. But I would say that most of the time that I spent with Peter, we just walked around. He never didn't have his camera. I don't ever remember Peter without the camera. And we just walked around. And I would be talking to him, and then I would become annoyed because he would be looking at something. Not me, the person talking to him. He took a lot of photographs in the street, but I'm not certain, I never really asked him about it. I'm not certain whether he, went out, he would say, let's go for a walk. Going for a walk was an activity, for me. But also, one thing Peter really taught me to do was notice light, which I do not believe I noticed before. He was always saying, look at the light, always, no matter where you were, and that is something that I've done the rest of my life since then.
But a lot of the time, what I imagine, anyway, is that your lifestyles were also very nocturnal. These movies were sometimes all-night movies that you were going to?
My way of life is still as nocturnal as I can afford to have it. I don't know about Peter. I went out every single night of my life until it was light, But even now that I'm old and I don't go out every night of my life, I'm up, So if you're going to be up, it's more fun to go out, But everyone I knew was out all night.
You mentioned you were not curious about New York in the 1930s, but part of what was involved, I think, in cinematic culture, being something you could still engage in New York City at that time, was seeing old movies. Old movies lived on in a way that...
Oh, yeah, we went to... Well, first of all, there were a lot of revival houses, and, there was Theater 80 St. Mark's, there were a million of them.
The Elgin.
The Elgin wasn't only a revival house. The Elgin, one of the great things about the 70s, about movies, was people would say things like, have you seen the new Buñuel? Which is quite different than, say, the new Tarantino, So we went to the movies all the time. We were obsessed with movies. The Elgin, at a certain point, the Elgin invented the midnight movie. The first one they showed was El Topo, which we thought was great, which, as you know, is horrible. If you see it as an adult, horrible. But at a certain point, the Elgin decided to run movies all night long. And we used to leave Max's. Max's closed at 4. We would go to the Elgin, watch movies till 9 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, the Museum of Modern Art started showing movies. So we would go uptown and watch movies in Museum of Modern Art. And I could do this for days on end.
Because perhaps of your connection with the magazine, you mentioned when we were talking about this season a few months ago that you knew Tennessee Williams, who of course is also present here at the Morgan.
I did not say I knew him.
Oh, okay.
I said I met him.
You mentioned, though, that Peter asked you to introduce him.
The only time I met him.
Okay, I see.
Right, there was a kid who told me his name, which I guarantee you was made up, who approached me in a bookstore, and he said that he was a friend of Tennessee Williams, and I, even at that young age, thought friend, I'm certain, is not the word you're looking for. And he said that Tennessee Williams wanted to meet me. This is something I didn't quite believe, but he arranged this for us to meet in a like a restaurant or bar on 42nd Street, like way over where, at that time, those theaters were new. I can't think what they're called, those theaters on 42nd Street, way west. And I told Peter, and Peter said he wanted to meet Tennessee Williams. I don't remember Peter ever particularly wanting to meet anyone, but he really wanted to meet Tennessee Williams. So we went up to this place. Tennessee Williams arrived. He was in awful condition, would be putting it mildly. He was with this woman whose name I can't remember, who was always with him. And she wrote about him a lot. And this kid, he could hardly walk. He had no idea where he was, who we were, who I was for sure, or who he was. He died within a few weeks. Peter was devastated. He was so disappointed. I didn't have any preconceived notion of, how Tennessee Williams would be. And he kept saying, but I thought he wanted to meet you. I said, well, this kid said he did. The kid got him there. He was there, He was polite, Tennessee Williams, but he was in, horrible condition. And Peter was very disappointed. The only other person I saw Peter be very excited about was when Peter was sick. When he was very sick, we took him to a doctor someplace on the Upper East Side. And at that time, there was this restaurant called like Madame Something's Omelet Palace. I forget what it was called. It was only omelets. Only rich people went there. It was the kind of place Peter loved. Of course, he'd never been. When we left the doctor's office, he was so depressed. It was very depressing news. And we walked out and we saw this place, and I said, Peter looked longingly in the window. It was like a place that an omelet cost like $30. So I said, do you want to go there? Yes, he said. Nothing cheered him up like luxury, really. And so we went in, and he was we were more than depressed. We were grief-stricken, and Dolly Parton walked in.
Wow.
And he completely came to life. And he said, there's Dolly Parton. And he was happy for the whole rest of the day. And later on in my life, I came to know Dolly quite well, and I told her this story. And I'm not a good mimic. In fact, I'm a terrible one, so I'm not going to mimic her. But, she said,
come on, you can do Dolly.
Why didn't you stop me? I would have been happy to. She's the nicest person. I would have been happy to talk to him. I said, well, I didn't know you, so that's why I didn't stop you. But Peter was, ecstatic to see Dolly Parton. He was a man of many interests.
Speaking of that, you and he were both, in your way, sort of self-taught into the position that you came in the world. You're both.
Yes, completely.
You finished.
Well, Peter, no, because you have to know things about taking photographs. Peter was people's assistant, right? Is that not true? Someone, no one told me how to do anything. And Peter had there's some skill. He printed the photographs. He had a dark room in his loft. I was terrified of it. I am terrified of chemicals. And that's what's in there, in case you're wondering, chemicals. And they smell like the kind of chemicals, that would be like on a nuclear waste site, And he would always say, you can come in, I'm going to show you how, but I wouldn't do it. I was too scared. I guess people don't do that anymore, I guess.
Not a lot.
Yeah.
Not a lot. But he was well read. He was interested in literature. Is that?
He was interested in everything.
So
yes.
What are some things perhaps that we'd be surprised to know
that he read?
That he was involved.
You know what? I don't know. I can't think of it. One thing that Peter did was read a lot of poetry, which I did not. The people I've known who've routinely read poetry are all visual artists. I don't know too many writers who read poetry unless they're poets, in which case I don't know them. But I don't specifically remember talking about books with Peter, to tell you the truth.
But other fields of arcana, one thing in particular.
Well, I was thinking when I saw this picture of Charlie Ludlam, that I used to also go with Peter to see the theater of all those theatrical.
The ridiculous theatrical.
Yeah. When I saw those pictures, I thought, there is the amount of talent that died, is 1 billion times more than will exist for the next 30 years. And a lot of the people, I didn't forget about Charlie Ludlam, but there were some people I completely forgot about that were incredibly talented. Yeah. It's really like a war that happened.
not only on the performing and creating side, but on the audience side.
On the audience side,
which
too.
is a
That's exactly right.
Tremendous change
Yeah.
for New York in particular. A phrase that he used to talk in particular about a singer was that she was one of the real ones. He was talking about Greta Keller and saying that Marlene Dietrich learned everything she knew from Greta Keller. You shouldn't listen to Marlene Dietrich, you should listen to Greta Keller. She's the real one. And I wonder if you have a sense, or if anything comes to your mind about who to him were the real ones of his time and his generation.
You'd have to give me the names and I would tell you. But I don't recall. But I forgot that he used to say that. He was very interested in music, you know, and very knowledgeable about it. I forgot that too, because and opera, and you know, he came to all these things completely by himself. Believe me. I mean, this is something he completely sought out. Every single thing, you know, he sought out on his own. I mean, when I saw these pictures, I was thinking, not only, you know, physically New York has obviously changed quite a bit, but I was thinking, if you're young and you look at some of these photographs, you don't understand the context of them. In other words, even tattoos were unusual then. You know, now there's not a single, like, dentist in the world who's not covered in tattoos. You know? And, you know, this world that you see was really a world apart from the world. You know, that, you know, the people like outside those rooms or in the other rooms didn't even know this world existed. And, you know, it's so caught on, you know, especially all the bad aspects of it, that now it doesn't, you can't really see it unless you're old enough to have remembered it.
It felt, the first I was in New York City was 1976. I was in junior high school at that time. And the feeling of it being exciting and being a little bit scary and also being just full of things that weren't anywhere else was so palpable at that time. And I wonder whether that New York that was made by and for New Yorkers, I'm not just talking about chock full of nuts, but the whole culture that Hujar's photographs are about is gone. Is there a New York that's about itself anymore?
No, I mean, of course that New York is gone, and it would be probably anyway if there had been like a normal progression, but there was not a normal progression. There was a plan to rescue New York from bankruptcy. You know, New York was going bankrupt. By the way, although I saw the headlines, you know, I didn't really know what that meant. You know, it didn't have any effect on me. I was always bankrupt. You know, so, you know, if you didn't have any money, the economy doesn't matter to you. You know, if you already don't have any money, what difference does it make? You know, it's like suddenly we were watching the stock market to see how we were doing. So that the plan to rescue New York, which was very publicized, you know, was, you know, the same, by the way, the same kind of thing that has brought you the Middle East. 4 men in a room with a pencil and a piece of paper. You know, 4 men who have no idea what they're doing, you know, but who are in charge of everything. And the plan to rescue New York was to bring tourists to New York. You know, which there is like, could be no worse thing for any place than tourists. It doesn't matter where the place is. You know, it is bad but for New York, it was horrible. And I knew it right away. And I kept arguing with people. They had this big campaign, I Love New York, people singing, you know, with pictures of apples, you know. You know, this, you know, heart, you know, instead of the word love. You know, it was like really the beginning of the end. And you know, the plan was, the first plan was, let's knock down Times Square. And, you know, the reason that New York was going bankrupt had really nothing to do with the fact that there weren't enough tourists here, by the way. So, I mean, there were always too many tourists here. But the tourists came to New York before that to see New York. But if you're going to have a plan to lure them here, you have to make a place they want to come to, which is not New York. I mean, New York was going bankrupt because New York was run by liberal Democrats who thought college should be free, hospitals should be free, and of course there's a point at which you can't do that any longer. But the idea was people were scared to come to New York. You know, it was dangerous, which it was dangerous. I mean, but I'm alive, you know, it wasn't that dangerous. And they were very scared, so it was to make it, you know, seem safe to them. And I always said you could make New York safer without luring these people here. we would like to be safer. You know, I mean, it's not like we love, to be, in constant terror. We're going to get mugged every second. So we would like to be safer. We would like to be cleaner. People always said to me at that time, "Oh, did you like it better when it was filthy?" No, but it could be cleaner. Without having these hordes of morons here. So, I mean, we're capable of being clean on our own. The Times Square thing, it's not like, Times Square was, I'm not saying Times Square was delightful before that. I'm simply saying that it was Times Square, and they decided, well, Times Square is the center, so we should knock it down and make it, a place not just safe, but especially alluring, to people whose other plans might be, to go to Disneyland. And I kept saying, no one is worried about what happens to our indigenous Times Square denizens. No one says, what about our 3-card Monte dealers? Where are they going to go? What about our hookers? What about our pimps? What about, so it worked, by the way. It did. They started coming, millions and millions and millions. Last year, the mayor proudly announced that 58 million tourists came to New York. 58 million. So, I know this is not the subject, but I just want to say, since you brought it up, that if they would put me in charge, I would say, all right, so there were 58 million tourists here last year, which means that 58 more million people fit here. Apparently, it's crowded, but I will stand at the border, and I will say, we could take 58 million immigrants who are good for a city, as opposed to tourists who are bad for a city. So, I would stand there and say, you can come in, but you have to stay. So I would just stand there and look at the luggage and think, that's it? No. Go back to Kansas or wherever you're from. And so we wouldn't have any hotels. Every place there's a hotel, there's no apartment building. Hence, a housing shortage. Plus, if people weren't coming here for these brief periods of time, no Airbnb. No, it would be immensely better, and all it would take is me in charge.
That's right.
And I know Peter would agree with me.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so.
Yes. I'm sold. Let's look at a couple of the people who did stay. If we could bring down the lights up above. There's Peter himself in his loft, and I'm just going to ask you about a couple of people in the show. This is Ethel Eichelberger as Minnie the Maid. Did you go to Ethel's performances?
Yes. Some of the people that Peter liked, I don't mean personally, but their work, I didn't, but I loved Ethel. Some of these people, some of them weren't, some of them just got dressed up, but some of them were really talented. But, these talents were so narrow. They were so narrowly pitched. The audience for them, died with them. And you could not reproduce that, because the world has changed so much. But Peter loved her, and Ethel was really talented.
I have almost a feeling of a kind of one-to-one relationship between what he did, which is about creating still images, and what Ethel did, which was just Quicksilver.
That's true, and also, often she was just hanging around in his apartment. I would go there, and Ethel would be there.
Greer Langton?
Yeah, I didn't know her that well.
Oh, you did not. Okay.
So.
David Wojnarowicz, who's a little dim from our perspective here, but you did not really know David very well, I think you said, until Peter got sick.
Until Peter got sick.
Yeah, uh-huh.
And when Peter met David, he was talking about him. He was in a band, David, not Peter, called 3 Teens Kill 4 or 4
Yes.
Teens Kill 3, I don't remember. And Peter was always talking about it, but I didn't pay attention, because Peter was always talking about different guys, and I never really was interested. And they didn't last that long. I didn't feel I had to really concentrate on the matter. And he kept talking about it, and I met him, and I didn't pay attention to him. And Peter was talking about him. And then when Peter got sick, when Peter got sick, several people, I don't know, like 6 or 8 of his friends, like kind of banded together to like figure out how to deal with Peter, to take care of him. And I came to know David really well. And I started having these very long conversations on the phone with David all the time. And David was grief-stricken. You know, I always thought, I don't think the romance lasted that long. It became, you know, another kind of relationship. To me, it seemed like a kind of father-son relationship. Peter decided to plan his funeral, which I could not bear. I could not deal with it. I kept saying, "You're not going to die. You're not going to die." You know, and so he said no. And Peter started seeing a priest. He did not tell me this. You know, he may have told some other people, but I did not know this. Peter, I guess, was born a Catholic. You know, I did not know Peter to be in any way a religious person. Yeah. But he started seeing a priest. He decided he wanted to have a funeral. He picked out a cemetery, which is like the most expensive Catholic cemetery in the country. Okay, and he gave a list of all the famous Catholic people who are born there. And, I mean, not born there, but buried there. Or perhaps born there. And he decided he wanted to have a plain pine coffin, which Orthodox Jews have. But, so he said, I said I would do this. He asked me to do this. But when I left there, I thought, I cannot do this. I can't do this. And David said, I'm going to go with you. There was, at that time, only one funeral home that would bury someone who had AIDS. They just refused. You know, there was no law compelling them to do so, and they just refused. I don't remember the name of it, but it's still there. It's on 14th Street. It's has an Italian name, and they were just, yes, of course we will. And I went there with David, and after we did this horrible thing, we went, you know, around the corner to have a hamburger, and I just became extremely close to him. I talked to him all the time. He designed the, headstone for Peter. He paid for it. It was very expensive. He was, I would say for, I don't know how long, but several months after Peter died, he went up there. It's in Westchester, this cemetery. He went there all the time. He would call in a fury. They're not properly keeping the grass or the flowers. And he was in a He was very obsessed with the actual physical place where Peter was buried. I went there one other time, I think. To me, it didn't have the same meaning that it had to David, but he was very connected to that.
Right next to that photograph in the show hangs this portrait of Cookie Mueller.
Yeah, I did know Cookie, but I knew her. You know, I was like friendly with her, but I was not close friends with her. She died. She died after Peter, I think.
That's right. Yeah. H.M. Kutukas?
Harry Kutukas. I think, is he alive?
He's not.
No.
No.
I did know Harry Kutukas, but he was alive much longer than Peter. Is that not right?
I don't know.
I think that was true because I remember him sending me something, you know, not recently, but more recently than when Peter was alive.
Okay. So he's one of the earliest composers for at Cafe Chino and later at La Mama, and creator of these shows. Did you attend?
Yes,
some
I
of
did.
those as well?
And Peter loved the theater, but you know that kind of theater. You know, I did too. I went all the time. I mean, Charlie Ludden for sure was my favorite by far. He was so excessively talented. You know, but all that stuff I went to with Peter all the time.
And lastly, if you could just talk about the making of this portrait. From the contact sheet, I know that Peter was with you and also with Vince Aletti at your family's place in Morristown. Vince is on the same contact sheet as we saw in the film, too, I think sleeping in an adjacent room.
Well, not in my room. Peter came very frequently with me to my parents' house. I would say that nothing was as exotic to Peter as middle-class domestic life. Nothing. He was so struck by it. You know, that he was really, it's one thing he had never seen. He had never seen it. I doubt that he had thought about it, but he was he came often with me to my parents' house. So I don't, when this picture first appeared, I mean, to my awareness, was, I don't know, a couple years ago, someone called me and said, Lena Dunham is tweeting this picture of you. Maybe tweet is not the correct word, but whatever the word is. And described it. I had no idea they were talking about. Then said, well, there's a show at this gallery in Soho where this photograph is. So I went to see it because I didn't know what they were talking about. And I recognized, of course, this was my sister's bedroom. I just want to make that clear. Now, this had been, the room itself, not that you're interested, had been my bedroom, until I left home when I was 17, at which point I was not even out the door. My sister was moving into the room. So, and it was then redecorated, not by me, this. So this, when I saw the photograph, of course I recognized it. Now I've seen it numerous times. I know where it is, but I have zero recollection of Peter taking this photograph. When I saw the picture, I had never seen it before. That is for sure. I had never seen it. He never showed me this photograph. I had never seen it before. I didn't remember that he took it. He, as I said, he came often to my parents' house. I recently was showing someone a photograph from one of Peter's books, and when I pulled the book out of my bookcase, the copy I took was signed to my parents, so that must have been the one that I took from my father's house when he died, and he'd given that to them. My parents really liked him a lot. I'm not certain they knew he was gay. I'm not certain they knew I was. But they liked him a lot, and he went there very often. If I went home to my parents, I would take leftovers from home. My mother would say, and give these to Peter. Here's what Peter was like. Here's how crazy Peter was. I would call Peter, who was starving to death, and say, Peter, I have this roast chicken or whatever from my mother's house. Do you want to come over and eat it? And he would say, does your mother cook in aluminum pans? And I would say, I don't know. What do you mean? Because he would get on these kicks where he would read that if you ate food cooked in aluminum pans, that you would drop dead of some horrible cancer. And if she you have to call her to find out, because if she cooked it in aluminum pans, I can't eat it. It's very toxic, friend. You shouldn't eat it. I said, Peter, you fuck strangers in Subway Johns. I said, you could do brain surgery on the floor of my mother's kitchen without getting an infection. I said, this is nuts. I mean, there were times where he saw the wisdom of that and times he didn't. But he would definitely get on these kicks of what was very dangerous, which would never be anything he was doing, of course. It would be something like we'd breathe or you would eat or, some kind of you shouldn't eat tomatoes. He went through a big thing about tomatoes.
Tomatoes?
Yes. Tomatoes are a nightshade vegetable. I remember this phrase. I don't even know what it means. And they are very dangerous to eat, Fran, and you should never eat them. And so I would say, Peter, Italy. Well, they're wrong because tomatoes are very dangerous. He would get on these kicks. I remember he once decided that the reason that he was not succeeding as a photographer was because his first and last name began with different letters. And that all the people who succeeded in life, their first and last name began with the same letter. And he would give you lists of the people. At the moment, the only one I remember was Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe. And I pointed out that, although she did have quite a successful career, her life maybe not that spectacular, but he would believe this. He would also, I forget what it was called. I think it was called numerology. The letters of your names corresponded with a number, and this was why this was happening, and this is why that was happening. This show that he was supposed to have fell through because the person's name, the numbers and the letters did not correspond correctly, and that's why the show fell through. And I said, maybe because you broke a bar stool over his head. Maybe that's why the show fell through. He had a horrible temper, Peter, and especially if someone was trying to help him.
So did you experience it?
Yeah, toward me?
The temper?
No.
No.
No. On the other hand, I wasn't really helping him that much.
I have the sense also, and I hope it comes through through the film and also through the exhibition, just the range of things that Peter Hujar was connected to, the number of things that he wanted to see in depth and through his work to connect himself to, and also how compartmentalized that seems to be. It seems typical that you didn't know that he had ever made prints of that portrait of you. And something else which many people were surprised to learn that we found out in the course of the research for the show was that he, on his second trip to Italy in the early 1960s, he was going to film school. He was studying film directing, cinematography in Rome, which is something that even his boyfriend from the previous couple of years, who was in touch with him all that time, never knew until the end of Peter's
I didn't
life.
either.
He never talked about filmmaking as something that had been
No,
important to him in his youth.
I mean, it was at Paul Tech, is that it?
No, Joseph Raphael.
And he was before Paul Tech, right?
That's right.
So Paul Tech, there's a lot of photographs of
Yeah.
Paul Tech there. I didn't know Paul Tech through Peter, because Peter did not speak to him for like a decade or maybe more, I don't know. And I happened to be at Peter's loft one day, and Paul Tech showed up, apparently after a silence of like 8 or 9 years. And he just showed up at his loft. There didn't seem to be any tension, It was just he like dropped by as if he'd seen him 2 days before. We stayed there for a while. Then we left. I walked out with Paul. He said, "Do you want to go get a cup of coffee?" There was a particularly filthy place around the corner where Peter lived, like a kind of place where, truthfully, when the waitress came and asked what I wanted, I felt like saying, "Lysol, give me a cup of Lysol." But after that, I became friends with Paul, and I talked to him all the time and saw him all the time. Peter did not like that much, because even though he was happy to see him, I guess he wasn't that happy to see him. Malcolm Morley also saw that there was a picture of it. I also met Malcolm there. People drop by Peter's house all the time. It was really common. You almost were never there for more than like 45 minutes without someone stopping by. I guess he liked that, because otherwise he would have stopped it.
Something I've been told also that he did a lot at the loft was simply watch TV, that he was a channel.
Once he got the TV.
Once he got the TV.
He got the TV with a Guggenheim grant, which I yelled at him. I yelled at him for this. TVs were much more expensive then, relatively, than they are now. And maybe it wasn't Guggenheim, it was some sort of grant. And it was, I don't remember, but it was like $500, which was like, for me at that time, 5 months' rent, And he said, "I'm buying a television." I said, "What is wrong with you? Why would you blow this huge amount of money on something as stupid as a television? You need the money." We bought the television. He goes, "I really want one, and I'm going to watch it." I said, "You're never going to watch it. What are you going to watch on television? What's on television?" But he did. He watched it all the time. He got his money's worth out of it.
And it was just the one television from there on, I guess. Seems most likely.
Yeah, I think it
Yes,
was.
right, yeah.
But I mean, a television set was like now they're very inexpensive, relative to the amount of money people have. But then it was like not like buying a car, but it was a big thing to buy. A stupid thing for Peter to buy. I still agree with myself about that.
Is there anything that you've always wanted to say about Peter that you've never had the chance to? It's hard to believe that would be the case, but
Yes, impossible.
impossible. In that case, I hope that everybody will return with us back upstairs and take another peek at the exhibition, and give thanks both to the composer and the cinematographer of the film, Joe Williams and Graham Haber, and especially to our gracious guest tonight, Fran Lebowitz. Thank you very much.
Thank you.